Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture, one weekly conversation at a time. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Google Play, and a whole bunch of other venues. Just visit our sites, chimeraobscura.com/VM or vmspod.com to find more information, along with our RSS feed. And follow the show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod. Well, it's been another hectic feeling week, although I can't point to anything anxiety-inducing, which kind of makes me think it's me. I mean, this week I got a meeting with my board of trustees on Friday, and that always fills me with some trepidation. But, no, a long time ago, I was able to explain to myself, your board is here to help you succeed, Gil, not to watch you fail. And that eased my mind a lot. I just have to remind myself of it periodically. But I got a lot of good stuff to tell them about and think Friday will go well. But the bigger thing was that yesterday afternoon there was a memorial for Michael Denneny, the queer editor and writer I was going to record with last April. As you may or may not recall, depending on whether you're a long-time listener, etc., I showed up at Michael's apartment in New York. That was Saturday, April 15th. I found 4 days worth of newspapers outside his door, called in a wellness check with one of his neighbors. And at that point, the police and the super had to break the chain on his door, and they discovered his dead body in bed. It was a tougher experience on me than I necessarily thought in terms of emotional or psychological fallout beyond that day. The next day, I recorded this big monologue about it and thought that was a big cathartic thing for me. And hearing from all his friends and colleagues in the following week, I thought got me passing off a lot of it. It didn't. There's still all sorts of stuff going on in my head from that experience. So I went to the memorial yesterday in New York City, and I can't talk too much about it, well, partly because I'm still working through how it went, partly because of the low blood sugar I was experiencing that resulted in my not exactly recalling everything. I will say that after the program of scheduled speakers, they invited anyone else up to speak, and I kind of hemmed and hawed about it, but one of Michael's friends, when I asked him, said, yes, get up there and speak. So I closed down the event. I was the last speaker. I began with something I'm pretty sure was like, I'm probably the only person in this room who never met Michael, but I'm the person who found him at the end. And it went on from there. I remember saying some stuff. I remember my voice is a lot different than it usually is. They recorded the whole event. So we're going to find out whatever else I said when that becomes available. I will say I've received texts and emails from Michael's friends who were there thanking me for whatever it was I said. And even at the time, I had some people came up to me to thank me. I do remember that part of it all. And I had this really lovely conversation with Michael's housekeeper. She went on a few people before me. I think she was third, and I was last. She's a Latino woman who spoke in really broken English about how much Michael meant to her and her family, and she cried a bunch. And Michael's brother Joe came up to comfort her. And when she and I talked as the event was breaking up, we traded notes about what happened that week that Michael died and how she almost went up to his place the day before, the Friday, the 14th of April, and would have discovered the pile of newspapers outside the door and would have, called in and been one of the people who found him. And she felt bad about not being there for him, but I told her that I was glad it was me and not her. My whole thing about that experience with Michael is that I was the accidental witness to this whole thing. But, part of the accident is that I got to spare her from the shock of being there, of actually seeing him. And I don't know. It was a complicated day. I think I feel better now. I'm not 100% sure, and I really should get to the episode. So anyway, I've got a lot of other stuff going on and prep for the board meeting. So let's get on with the show. This week, you are going to get something almost as daunting as the episode I recorded after finding Michael back in April. This episode is a conversation with Joseph Monninger, who is the author of the new memoir, Goodbye to Ticking Clocks, How We Live While Dying, from Steerforth Press. See, around Memorial Day 2021, just a few weeks before I got my diagnosis of chronic lymphocytic leukemia, which we refer to as the best bad news, Joe Monninger was diagnosed with stage 4 non-small cell lung cancer. And this was 3 days after he retired from decades of teaching English at Plymouth State University. And he was facing, as he put it, death by Labor Day of 21. But some biomarker testing revealed that he might benefit from a cancer drug from AstraZeneca called Tagrisso, and it turned out to work. 2 years later, he is still around, and he has published a memoir about that first year, basically. Goodbye to Ticking Clocks is a profound book that doesn't strive for profundity, if I can make sense with that. Joe balances the facts. He balances the story of his diagnosis and the early treatment and the panic and the lung draining that he has to undergo regularly and the fingers crossed moments of finding out whether Tagrisso was working. He balances that with an exploration of his life and of what it means to live, we'll say without regret. He talks about the books and the fishing trips and the sports he played and the Peace Corps stint and the students and all the other factors and the important stuff that comprise a life in the lens of not knowing how much time you have left, which we know nobody knows how much time I have left, but in his case was a really, much narrower window than the rest of us. And Joe manages to bring us face to face with what, the worst news looks like. And he does it without falling into self-pity or platitudes or, a better world after this one, that sort of thing. He wrestles with what it means to work his whole life and get this diagnosis, again, 3 days after retiring, when all those plans and everything he wanted to do is truncated, cut off. But he strives to make the most of the remaining time. And as the drug begins to get results and prolong his life, he starts making plans again as the book is progressing. And it culminates in this really special trip that he and his partner Susan take. But it's not a bucket list project or anything like that. Joe seems to be firmly in my boat that bucket lists are for suckers who didn't live when they had the chance. What he's about in this book is that there are real joys to be found in the magic of the day-to-day. And for a memoir about terminal cancer, Goodbye to Ticking Clocks is full of life. And actually, that puts me in mind of the first part of this intro about Michael Denneny's memorial. See, I should have talked less about me and more about the other speakers who were there and all their stories about Michael. But there's no time to go into all that. And again, I'll probably try to share the recording of the event afterwards at some point. But what I want to get at is I was there as this specter. I was the one guy who never met Michael, but I'm the guy who saw him lying there dead in bed. But everybody else who was there, they were there to celebrate his life and not the circumstances of his death. And again, cross with the blood sugar thing, that celebration just, elated me in a similar way to Joe's book, because the subtitle really holds up How We Live While Dying. And from my perspective as a veritable tourist on planet Cancer, it's a joy to read about someone finding more to live for and ways of making his life matter, even when his illness constrains what he can do. There's a fishing trip that goes awry because the lung condition he has just there are complications, and he basically has to bail on what would have been this great retreat with a bunch of his buddies. But I just treasure the fact that we have people like Joe in this world who can offer a path to living without trying to be a guide. They can sort of set the example, I guess. Anyway, as caveats go, his mic was a little bit distant, so I kind of equalized the volume a little bit. You'll pick up on that once the conversation starts. Oh, and I want to thank my old pal Vince Ches. He's the guy who told me about Joe and his memoir. So he discovered Joe through another book, one about boxing. And he wrote me about Joe after my Substack last week, where I wrote about how to live in the 6-month intervals between all clear oncology appointments. And what you do with those 6 months before you run up into the next one where maybe the news won't be as great. But reading this book and talking with Joe, it's changed how I look at all those moments in between, you know? Now here's Joe's bio. Joseph Monninger is the author of 8 novels and 2 memoirs. He has written for Sports Illustrated, American Heritage, Scientific American, and the Boston Globe. He is a 2-time recipient of fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts. He lives in New Hampshire. And now, the Virtual Memories conversation with Joseph Monninger. I know, as someone who has talked publicly about his own cancer/leukemia experience, this is the most irritating question of all, but how are you?
Well, I'm doing fine. I have my moments where I feel particularly good, and then other moments where I don't feel so great. I'm tired a good deal, and it's hard to know whether that's the illness, my age, what's going on. So we're constantly sort of monitoring what my body is doing. But I feel good. But to a large extent, I feel pretty strong.
Good. That's, again, always my irritating thing now that people know about my very, very scant exposure to planet cancer. Yeah. Everybody has to solicitously ask, how are you?
I appreciate it because, it is something that's on my mind a great deal. And obviously for the other person, it's not quite as acute. But it's a constant thing I'm living with. So I appreciate the question.
Sure. Now, tell me, with Goodbye to Clocks Ticking, when did you start writing it? And you can walk through your time from diagnosis on to that experience. But in the reading of it, I'm pretty sure he's in the process of writing it, but we're not actually getting the insight into that from a reader perspective.
Right. Well, you've probably heard this before, but as somebody who's spent a lot of years writing, most of what I do, I process through writing. So when I got this diagnosis, one of the things I did was to I have a little cabin out in the back meadow of my house in New Hampshire. It used to be my son's play fort. And I go out there and there's no distraction, no internet, no anything, no electricity. And so I kind of fiddle sometimes with ideas, and I may make a start on things and see whether it's going anywhere. Sometimes I write a good deal and then cancel. It doesn't seem like it's quite working. So with this, I began sort of writing, and the opening line is "I'm dying," which I kind of had to confront and accept. And it went from there, where I guess I had some things to say about it, and I needed a way to process it and to frame it for my own personal interests.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd wondered, because you had that line in the book. I mean, you quote the Annie Dillard moment of, if you knew you were dying, what would you write? And there's a line in there that jumped out at me as somebody who was contemplated this in the face of his own, dealing with mortality. It was difficult to regain the illusion of a younger artist, that what we created was important and necessary, and that my voice and the countless chorus of voices that contributed to literature somehow mattered. And that sense for you of finding that you needed to write this, you needed to bring this into the world?
Well, I mean, if I take a step back, of course, I don't need to bring it into the world. I think we have plenty of books.
We know we don't need, but yeah, go.
But, as a young person, I was just so blindly uh, persuaded or convinced of my own voice, and that I had to get this out, and I wanted to write. And, I wasn't 100% sure why I wanted to write, but I felt this urge to do it. And if you had probably stopped me at that point and said, how important is it? I would have said, well, it's important. I would have been at loss to say why it was important, but inside of me, it felt important. Now, at the age of 70, which I am more or less in with this cancer diagnosis, kind of hard to talk myself into that. And so that's a little difficult to live with, to realize that what we were doing is important, but it isn't absolutely necessary for the world. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. Yeah. But there is that sense of legacy, I guess. I mean, you have more than a dozen books that you'd written, and you had generations of students. To what extent did you, did you contemplate, your legacy and what you'd created and what mattered and what doesn't matter as you go through this? And we'll talk about, the shared experience of unsubscribing to all those newsletters and retailers when you first find out.
Yeah. That was a good feeling. That was liberating.
Oh God, it was tremendous. That was my 10-day gap of thinking I was going to die in 6 months. I was like, well, unsubscribe. Yeah.
One of the lines I like in my book that I wrote that gained strength as I kind of took a distance away from it was that to receive a cancer diagnosis is to be going along in a boat, and then the engine cuts out and the boat continues, but the wake kind of catches up to us. Everything stops and slows down, and the forward momentum is no longer there. So this, the writing process and the legacy with students and all of that. I mean, if authors are honest with themselves, we are read by very few people. Unless you hit it gigantic, unless you're Stephen King, you not that many people read your book. I'm always surprised when somebody has read my book. It's almost like they said, "Hey, by the way, we saw your chimney fire last night" or something. It just comes out of the blue to me.
Yeah, it is. To me, it's one of the weirder experiences, either when someone writes me out of the blue about listening to the podcast, or even stranger when I've been at like festivals talking to someone and someone comes up and, "Are you Gil Roth?"
Right.
Just recognizing my voice from this thing is a pretty disturbing phenomenon. But
do you feel embarrassed when that happens a little bit?
Yes,
I do
every time.
I don't know why. It's like, I'm sorry. Yes, I am that guy who wrote that thing.
Well, in my case, people usually cite something like, "Oh, when you said X, to this person," I'm like, "Dude, I don't remember what I said this morning. I'm really not going to remember something from 3 years ago, but I'm touched that you actually, Yeah,
and I am. And listen, I count very highly those moments where somebody has read something I've written and it seems to mean something to them. I mean, that's what we're in this for. So what the heck?
Yeah. It's got to be again, an embarrassing but good feeling.
Yeah.
But and the book has come out. Goodbye to Clocks Ticking has come out just a few months ago. Have you been? Well, what has the response been? Have you been hearing from people about it?
Yes, actually, but not as many people as I perhaps thought I would have heard from.
Well, after this podcast, it'll be huge. Yeah, I'm just kidding.
Yes. No, I think it's a particular kind of book. It's a book, obviously, about living with cancer, so not everybody's going to pick it up on the way to the beach. I think it's a book that's passed from hand to hand to people who say, "Hey, this might be useful to you as you go through your cancer journey." So yes, it's had a very nice reaction. It's very nice reviews and all of that, but it's not on the front page of the New York Times Book Review either.
Well, again, we'll do our best through the show here, but the question that I wrestle with when it comes to talking to someone who I know is at least received this sort of diagnosis. In your case, the AstraZeneca drug has actually indefinitely prolonged things, which for which I'm really thankful. But that question of what brought you solace, or was there anything in terms of books and authors that kind of helped you either in that immediate phase of thinking this is the end, or once things became more open-ended? And you mentioned Robertson Davies and Fifth Business and some other types of books, but, are there authors you find yourself re-embracing?
Well, probably yes. I mean, certainly one of the guys, I always loved John D. MacDonald, the Travis McGee mysteries, and I can read those just about any time. It seems to be that I can read them any number of times and forget most of the plot, but just enjoy what's going on. So there are people like that. But what's been also interesting is I've kind of found out that there's a whole little bookshelf that I knew nothing about cancer, How We Die. And I can't remember the name of the author, but it's a wonderful book, won the Pulitzer Prize. And it talks about death in a way that's really illuminating. The Emperor of All Maladies, which is this great history of cancer, which is just fascinating. I mean, cancer is such a pervasive thing in our society, and most of us, honestly, know very little about it until it strikes you or somebody in your family, and then you become educated on the subject. So there are books like that I've been finding interesting to go through. Not that I want to dwell on the thing, but these people have something to tell me about the experience that I'm having.
We'd say it's literally a morbid preoccupation in this case, but yeah, same thing with me. I actually also ended up building the bookshelf of not survival narratives, but the authors who wrote their memoirs while they were dying and knew they were dying, like Hitchens and Oliver Sacks and Harold Brodkey and people like that. Yeah. But again, I may have a more morbid outlook on life than you did going into this experience.
I don't know about that. Yeah, no, it's a particular flavor of book, I think. So I've never been a very disciplined reader. In fact, I saw on your website that you have kept track of all the books you've read since college.
Only because I will forget otherwise. So
yeah.
I keep a giant spreadsheet of all this because otherwise, I think I read this once upon a time, right. but yeah.
Well, I have an old friend named Jonathan Carroll, who is a surrealism writer. He lives in Vienna. I lived in Vienna for a time. And he's kept track of all the books that he's read in his entire life. I was always flabbergasted by that because I am like whirlwind going through books. I read a sports book, then I read something about death, then I read a mystery. Then I've never had a very disciplined approach, nor have I ever really tracked what I've read. But I've constantly been reading. That's for most of my life.
Yeah. Where did the writing life start for you?
Well, when I was mostly an athlete. I grew up in a big Irish Catholic family in New Jersey, and I had 4 brothers. And so we played a lot of sports, a lot of wiffle ball in the backyard and all of that. And so I really thought I was going to be a professional athlete. It seems kind of funny now when I look back on it, but I had my reasons. I was a pretty good high school quarterback and went to college on a football scholarship. So I wasn't completely nuts about it. But I'd always read. I read the Hardy Boys. I read Sports Illustrated, which we got in the house. So I read those kinds of things. And then I had this miraculous thing where when I was graduating school, I went through the student union one day, and there was a little sign-up thing that said, join the Peace Corps. And I thought, well, okay, I'll put in this application, and I did it. And frankly, I forgot that I even applied. And I was looking at a job. This is down in Philadelphia. I was looking at a job at John Wanamaker's, which is the big department store, the Macy's of Philadelphia, and they were suggesting that I could become a clothes buyer. And I had no idea what a clothes buyer was, and I certainly wasn't a clothes horse. I didn't care anything about clothing. So I was thinking that, and then this letter came in the mail and said, "Congratulations, you've been accepted to go to Upper Volta." And I had no idea. I thought at first it was Russia, like Upper Volga.
Yeah, name like that.
Yeah. And then I thought, well, is there Lower Volga? What is this? Well, Upper Volta is now Burkina Faso. It's in the heart of West Africa. At that point, it was the second poorest country in the world. So I went over there kind of blindly again as kind of a old frat boy football player. Not that I was in a frat, but I was just kind of a beer drinking.
The mentality there.
Yeah. And I suddenly found myself on a plane going to first Paris and then to Ouagadougou, which is the capital of Burkina Faso, and then being put out in a tiny little village without running water, electricity for 2 years. But the thing that the Peace Corps did was they sent you with a trunk of books. So books became extremely important to us, to all the volunteers there. And we would trade them. I mean, the fatter the book, the better. We read the Leon Uris books, these big fat things. Anything. I mean, really, I read most, I don't know if all, but I think most of Dickens at that point in time, which, I don't have time to read all of Dickens, during my working life, but I did then. And so that got me reading. And then I guess this little secret urge to write started kicking in. And I started writing things by hand on a piece of paper. And after my first year, Peace Corps volunteers get a break. So I went down to Ghana and spent some time on the beach there and doing that. And when I came back, termites had eaten the manuscript that I wrote, which was, believe me, was a saving grace for literature. We did not need that. But that got me interested. And so I started doing it. And looking back now, if I talk to that 23, 24-year-old guy, whatever I was, I would say, are you crazy? You're just going to write this stuff and just send it. I had no idea. No, I'd never taken a writing course, never talked to anybody about publishing, not a thing.
At the same time, when you talk about crazy and impulsive, joining the Peace Corps out of the blue, it also, fits that category. So. Yeah,
although, it was John F. Kennedy's thing, and I was raised a Catholic in New Jersey. So it's kind of like, the nice thing you do if you can't become a priest. I don't know. Who knows why we did? You want some adventure. You want some different things. I knew I didn't want a kind of conventional life going into New York City and working like my dad did, all his working life. So, yeah, it was a way to travel and see the world a little bit.
Did religion matter to you when you were young?
No. Well, I mean, I went to mass. We were raised that way, but I didn't really. I thought it was kind of silly even then. Even when I was a young person in catechism class, they'd say these things like, "And then Jesus walked on the water," or "Then the snake talked to," or Balaam the ass, the donkey talked.
Yeah.
I thought, what world are we in? What is this? It didn't make any sense to me whatsoever. And nobody that I turned to ever had any good ideas about why that was true. They just kind of accepted it.
Yeah, because otherwise you're going to hell,
right.
Which, again, yeah. But yeah, I'd want to, you had the contemporary atheist, contemporary Joe in the book is atheist. I just wasn't sure if that carried over from childhood or anything happened in life that kind of disillusioned you otherwise.
No, it's interesting. My dad was a Georgetown graduate, so he went, Jesuit schools and things like that. And I remember after my mom had died and I was in college, like first or second year of college, and I came home and it was Sunday, and I said to my dad finally, summoning the courage, I said, "Dad, I don't really believe this stuff, and I don't really want to keep going to mass." And he said, "Well, you're pretty much an adult now. You can do what you want," which, to his credit, was a nice thing. And then about the next month, he stopped going to mass. So maybe he'd been faking it along the way. I don't know.
Yeah, I've heard that sort of phenomenon with families that, "Oh, I was only doing this for you guys." Right. Oh, okay. Now that's all off the table. Yeah. But yeah, it's again, we all. For me, there was the sense, and again, I've talked about this, and it's shorthand at this point, but before I got the actual diagnosis, when I assumed I only had a few months left to live, there was boy, what do I evaluate my life as or under? At no point was there how do I, make things good with God or whatever spiritual thing is out there. It was more what have I done in the imminent world that's worth remembering?
Yeah. Gil, how did you manage psychologically? This is a big question to just drop on you, but how did you manage
please.
that 6-month period, that interval where you really thought, game over?
It was only 10 days of that. And then I went into the oncologist's office and Polish woman, she goes, "Oh, this is wonderful. You have the best bad news." Yeah. I'm like, "I'm sorry. I just saw a woman who looked like a wraith when I was walking into this building, and I assume that's going to be me." No, you're going to go decades before this even needs treatment, and the treatments are great. So I went from 10 days of assuming I'm going to die but before the end of my 50th year into you've got another 20 or 30 years. But what was great was being a micromanaging control freak and getting told there's no cause for what happened to you, or what's developing in your blood. There is no cure for it, and nothing you do will affect whether it progresses or not.
Wow. That's a lot.
And I was like, wow. Yeah, that's certainly a change of mentality for me. So it was not just the psychological aspect of mortality, but as a Buddhist friend of mine put it when I'd said it, was that realization that, all that sense of control that I had, that the hands on the steering wheel, was untrue. He said, when you really reach Satori, you'll realize there is no steering wheel.
Right.
It's not just your hands. There is no steering. And I thought, oh, yeah, I got a ways to go.
Right.
But,
yes.
yeah, this was all part of, welcome to 50 for me. But,
well, it's interesting, though, the psychological element of this, and I feel like I'm wrestling with that more now than I did earlier. You're going on a camping trip. Where are you going for like a month, or are you going for like 2 years? It makes a difference on how you approach it and what you bring along on the trip. And I find I'm wrestling with that a little bit. That's been a problem for me.
Yeah, and that's what I found fascinating in the book. Again, I can only compare it to my own experience, where it turned into come back every 6 months and, we'll see. But chances are you're going to be in your 70s when this finally needs treatment. To your experience of you're going to die in the next couple of months. Oh, wait, it turns out there's a wonder drug that might benefit you, to, hey, things look pretty good. No idea how long it's going to last, but
exactly.
Yeah. And I wonder mentally, I'm very thankful you had the wherewithal to write the book you wrote in the midst of that, because I know that's nothing is behind you. No. You're still facing this grand unknown.
I keep this phrase "return to life" keeps coming back. It's from Charles Dickens' *A Tale of Two Cities*, which I used to teach. And there's the old guy, I forget exactly how it worked, but he's in prison and he's buried in the prison, and he's a cobbler. And his hair has grown wild and everything else. And his loving daughter, in typical Dickens fashion, comes to bring him back. He's freed and he's returned to life. And I keep thinking, return to life. That happened to me too. So, yeah, I thought I was dead. I thought I was done by Labor Day. I got diagnosed in May, and I thought I was out by Labor Day. And there was a certain, I won't say beauty, but there was a certain resignation to that I could accommodate myself to. And then suddenly I'm pulled back, and that's tough.
You got to keep living.
Yeah. It's like, well, okay, so then maybe I do need to think a little bit differently about, what to do next. And honestly, my plan had always been to leave teaching, retire finally and do something else. But then, I don't have the physical stamina to do something else. So it's a complicated thing, and I'm sorting it out to this day.
Yeah. And again, it's that sense of whiplash. In my case, the roller coaster turned into, you're going to keep going up indefinitely. In your case, that indefinite is based on clinical data. There's a narrower window or a narrower rise, I guess.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's well, again, it's that question of, what, not what prepared you, but what helps you get along through that. I mean, you mentioned Marcus Aurelius in the book, and I thought I was being clever bringing a copy of Meditations to the oncologist's office for my second consult. But once I was in the waiting room, I realized, there is no clever. You're just
you're better off reading
a room full.
You're better off reading People magazine.
Yeah. Well, the other great thing I learned was no one looks up.
Right.
I got in there and realized no one is making eye contact with anybody else. And I felt like the luckiest man every time I've been there, because I've seen people in much worse shape. And I'm just like, wow, I'm a tourist and the rest of you are going through something much tougher.
Yeah. But, no, well, the whole Marcus Aurelius thing, I've spoken a couple of times about this, and I am by no means an expert on Stoicism or that period of time, and I don't really know that much about Marcus Aurelius as an emperor and as a soldier. But I have found his book comforting over the years, and I sometimes give it to students or somebody who's graduating or in a passage of life, and I say, do not sit down and try to read this. Put it on your lap, put it away. Some night when you're feeling a little bit blue or sad or happy even, pick it up and read it then. And it has a leveling influence. And only read a paragraph or two, or, his little statements, and skip all the parts that says, thanks to this or that, teacher and all that. Let that go and just try to boil down what he's saying. And you'll find something worthwhile. I mean, I'm not alone in that, obviously.
And how did Susan, how has she been handling the same roller coaster, the partner in your life?
Yeah. I don't
want you to say anything that violates her privacy, et cetera. But,
yeah.
How much time do you spend worrying about how much time she spends worrying about you?
I am worried about her, worried in the sense that she's connected her fate, at least in the near future, to a guy who's not going to be around. And that's rough. I mean, she willfully is helping me, right? This is not something she has to do. So she is the most important person in this whole thing. And I worry about her welfare more than anybody, only because not that the loss of me is going to be that big a deal, but when we lose anybody, it's a big gap that's left afterwards. And I'm not going to feel that gap because I'm not going to be here, but she will. So it's a very brave thing I think she's doing to remain as close to me and to give me so much support. It's admirable. It's admirable in all ways.
It's again, with my literary bent, it was the most touching part of the book for me when she asked you for the list of the books that matter to you, so that in reading them after you're gone, she'll, at least have some resonances, or so she hoped. And then that gave you the terrible challenge of trying to figure out what the books were.
Yeah, but I kind of like doing that. I divided it into decades, as you might recall. And I think it's good. I mean, we're doing this podcast right now, but I'd like to sit and talk to you about what books meant a lot to you in your life. Because
trust me. I always say this is a conversation. So ask anything, anytime you want. I will tell you as weird examples of that go. Not many years ago, 2015, I was involved in this big negotiation with the FDA, and I represent a trade group in the pharmaceutical industry, which we'll prattle about later. But they thought I was some Washington lobbyist hustler until a few months into the negotiation, they finally Googled my name to figure out who is this guy anyway. That left them more confused than before, because I showed up to a negotiating session and they were like, so how do you decide what book you're doing for that thing you do? I'm like, you guys looked me up finally, didn't you? Yeah. And then the lead negotiator, I was going into the bathroom, he was coming out, he's like, we saw your life. What are your 5 favorite books? I'm like, well, I could give you 5 now, but chances are by the time we get to the conference room, it'll be 5 different ones. Yeah. But I'm willing to throw a bunch out there right now. Yeah. So yeah, that's always the challenge with this stuff. It does raise the question. It came up with the very first dying guest that I had, a writing professor named D.G. Myers. I flew out to Columbus to record with him. And I asked him what he had not read, and something that he meant to get to over the years. At that point, he thought he had about 2 years left. It turned out he only had 6 months, prostate cancer recurrent, and that was it. But I'm pretty sure he mentioned that he'd never read Anna Karenina. And I said, are you gonna? He's like, well, not much point now. And I said, okay, I literally have no idea what I would do in that, but this is 2014, I think. But did you find yourself in that sort of with that like in Zelig, where he never read Moby Dick and finally gets around to it at the end?
Well, now I have to think about that because you asked the question.
Yeah, I had wondered whether that had come up at some point in your whole experience.
The one that pops out is the Divine Comedy, Dante's Divine Comedy. Never read that.
Oh my God, yeah, I only read it a few years ago.
Yeah,
and it's actually pretty good.
Is it pretty good?
I'm just kidding. It's I hope you get to it. I'll zap you the translator I used, which came on recommendation from my old liberal arts grad school, because to me, and again, your mileage may vary, as people say. Purgatory was much more interesting than the Inferno.
Yeah.
Because the Inferno's, graphic and everything horrible is happening and all these people deserved it. And Dante is putting all these people from his own life in there because he's vindictive, etc. Purgatory equals change.
Interesting. Yeah.
because the people in there, you know, they're suffering, they're undergoing these horrible torments, but they also have the possibility that something is going to change in their afterlife life. And it's to me, it was much more resonant because it was these again, that sense that there's something, don't want to say redeemable because we don't believe in redemption. But that there's something that, you know, can still be improved or that we can still learn, I guess.
Well, you know, I read years ago, the Golden Notebook, Doris Lessing's great novel. And in the foreword, I think it was to that, she said, if you ever come across a book and are not enjoying it, put it down. You don't need it. There are many other
books. Life is too short for shitty novels is my my short version.
Yeah. Well, and, you know, it may not be a shitty novel. It just may not be something that strikes your and this I find very interesting, is you can read a novel when you're 30 and then read a novel when you're 50, and they're very different experiences, the same novel. So when I picked up Moby Dick, I remember reading those long passages
the
about
cetology.
About ambergris and, you know, everything else, and I thought, I don't know whether I need this or not. Although I read other Melville stories that I loved, Typee and all those that I read right through. But Moby Dick, I don't know that I ever honestly finished it. I think I kind of just abandoned it. So that, I mean, I could say that would be another, but that's not another book that I regret not reading. I get the gist of it, and I like Gregory Peck in the movie, so.
But yeah, you'll have to get back to me though, as you look over your library and figure out, you know, I really did mean to get to, I mean, you have Bleak House, you have Middlemarch. I know you've got those mentioned in the book. So those are, you know, some of the majors to tackle.
When I look back, one of the most influential books of all time for me was the whole Lord of the Rings things, which came to me at a high school age. And I remember being swept away by it and thinking, oh my gosh, you know, this is terrific. I couldn't get enough of it. I couldn't put it down. And, you know, that stands out as a certain springboard to the rest of the reading that I did. I mean, I was reading before that, but that really kicked it off. Yeah. And it became cool when I was in school in the 70s. It was just part of like the 1969 Woodstock and all that. It became cool to be a guy and to read, which was, you know, not probably the case when you were in the 50s, you know, 1950s and all of that. And I'm not sure it's true today, but it was true then. And you had to read in order to be culturally relevant, sort of. So you would read lots of things. And Tolkien, for me, kind of kicked that all off.
Yeah, for me, there was the sense of being a comic book reader as a kid and getting stuffed into lockers because of that, and then seeing it take over the world. Yes. It's like, well, if I cared about this whole Arrested Development superhero thing, this would actually mean a lot to me. Unfortunately, I grew up the same time the rest of the world, you know, became immature. But yeah, that's me on my soapbox.
Gil, what were some of the big books that kind of kicked you off as a young man?
For me, it was a lot of science fiction when I was a kid. It was more space opera BS, and it took comics. Again, there was a writer named Alan Moore who did a big comic called The Watchmen back in the 80s. That was a big touchstone thing. But a few of his other works turned me on to like Thomas Pynchon, and that led to Henry Miller. And I have a strange, not personal, but personal connection with Philip Roth. And those are the books that once I started to get like 17, 18, you know, reading V for the first time by Pynchon, and then sort of having all that web of associations start spilling out, meant a lot to me. But, you know, weirdly, it came from a couple of comic book writers, that turned me on to good literature. And then once I got to college, it just turned into, even in late high school, there were a couple of good teachers who just, you need to read Invisible Cities by Calvino. You need to read that. And then they recognized I was that weird kid. Yeah. And, you know, we're willing to feed that, you know, that sort of thing. I don't know
that it's weird. I mean, I know what you're saying from high school society. It seems weird, but you know, I've always liked the people who read. You know, I don't understand how people go through life without reading.
Yeah. And that's the question that I have for you. During this experience now, do you still get joy from discovering a new book? Or even returning to old ones?
Yeah. In fact, I just read, I'm reading two different books. I read Ruth Rendell's The Vault. She's a mystery writer, British mystery writer. I didn't really like the book. I kept going through it going, I don't really like this book that much. But I read it and did that. And I'm also trying to read Wallace Stegner's short stories, which I like, but I'm having this odd feeling like, why is he held in such esteem? I think he's very good and he's very competent and all that. But is he really that? Is he this marvelous? I had a writing teacher, a guy named John Young, who used to say, it's just not marvelous enough. That was his criticism sometimes when you handed in a story. And I know what he means. Like, there's nothing really wrong with it. It's just not marvelous enough.
Yeah. Some things were part of you don't want to say the institutional literature thing, but there are writers you look at like, this is sort of factory fine writing as opposed to, bellow or something inspired,
Yeah. Didn't quite take the chances that I wanted, that some writing that I love takes. But, who knows? I mean, as long as you're reading, I think, book leads to book and it's just a wonderful thing. I marvel now at the books that I run into. I'm up here in Maine. The grocery store has a little, like 3 shelves of books that people put in and take out. You throw in $1 for some sort of, whatever charity function it is. And I'm always grabbing things like that, and sometimes I'm rewarded way beyond any expectation. Other times, I think, well, I don't really want to finish this. So I'm picky and choosy that way.
Yeah, I wasn't sure whether, whether the time means something different now in terms at least of how critical you are about, can I spend more time reading this book? Is it going to matter to me?
Oh, I still watch Judge Judy and,
good.
I'm not, I guess I truly have a Catholic mind. I mean, I used to say the best thing for a writer is to have a magpie mind. You just pick up little bits of, shiny objects and look at it and then throw it aside and go look for something else. I really have lived that way. I'm not disciplined in that sense. I like just looking at different things. I never had a course of study that I really, cared to follow. So I don't know. Who knows, right? It's what we do.
And I'm with you when it comes to, in the face of what, each of us have or both of us have faced, not everything needs to be meaningful. And, I can't, put myself in the most profound situation 24 hours a day. I spend my time watching Barney Miller reruns on Amazon Prime. Honestly, people say, you're watching Succession. I'm like, no, right now it's Barney Miller, Newhart, yes. Mary Tyler Moore, and MASH reruns. I kind of rotate among those 4 and then find, little contemporary stuff.
Yeah, I've always loved trash TV and all that. I don't make any bones about that. And I watched the Red Sox gloriously beat the Yankees last night. So,
yeah, son of a bitch. This goes back to the framework of you have to know where I come from, which was first generation American, born in northern New Jersey. And for us in the 1970s, protective coloration was everything. Yeah. So the Yankees were winning, therefore we cheer for the Yankees in 77, 78. So I've stuck with that all these years. But yeah, it's, but actually, how did you end up in New England starting from Westfield, going to Peace Corps, going to Vienna? What brought you to New England, and what did you find in New England that sort of kept you there? And don't just say a job.
Yeah, no, well, a little bit, right? Of course. I mean, I was in Africa, and then my first wife, actually, she ended up being my first wife. She's just a girlfriend at that time, came over to join me. She was a staff writer for Glamour magazine, and she came over, and we lived in a place right near Mopti, Mali, right on the Niger River. And the job that I had there really didn't pan out. I was working for USAID. And so we hemmed and hawed and decided. And she said, I don't want to live here. I was looking at a life with USAID and living overseas and, doing the expatriate thing, which, looking back, maybe one of the few regrets I have about my professional life. I might have enjoyed that. I maybe should have stayed in it. But I was young and I didn't really know what I was doing. So we were going to come back to the United States. And she had gone to the University of New Hampshire, and she said, Portsmouth is a nice town, and that's the basis for our decision. So we ended up moving to Portsmouth, and that's all it took. And then I got up there, and it was just a very different world than New Jersey. I mean, I loved my childhood growing up, but I could see there was a little more air to breathe up in New Hampshire and Maine and all of that. And I liked it instantly. I liked the woods, and I liked the lakes and the waters and all of that. I didn't have that in New Jersey. I mean, I know it's kind of available, but it's not really, a thing. It
is where I am. I'm way north on the border of New York State, but I live in the house I grew up in. I've been here virtually forever.
Really? That's good. That's interesting.
Yeah, it always freaks people out. I went away for college and moved 1 year with my mom down to Philadelphia, but I live in the house where I grew up, and that's always mind blowing to normal human beings.
It's kind of charming too, though, in a way.
Oh yeah, yeah. No, I've lived here longer than the ghosts have.
Yes.
I've my parents built it 3 years before I was born. I've outstayed everybody else. But yeah, but it one of the resonances for me with your book was with the New Hampshire and New England thing. Donald Hall, the poet and essayist, and well, living there, I only discovered him with his essays after 80, where he wrote these wonderful pieces, again, late in life. But when he wrote back about, well, the weird reversal situation of what you've gone through, he married a much younger woman, Jane Kenyon, when they were living up there. And his whole issue was, I'm old. I've just gotten over cancer. I'm going to die before you. It's going to be terrible. And she ends up developing leukemia and dying at 47. Yeah. And he's got the rest of his life ahead of him. Right. And that just kept echoing throughout Goodbye to Clocks Ticking, right up through your the brief aside about one of your ex-wives reaching out and contacting you about this, because he sort of has the same experience in a wonderful essay called One Road, where he and his first wife reconcile as she's ill. But yeah, talk a little about, I guess, that sense of not just with ex-wives, but it's something you go into in the book. Again, that notion of reconciling or covering up past or fixing past issues, and why that does and doesn't matter, right, to you.
Well, I do want to interject real quick. Jane Kenyon was a heck of a poet herself. She was tremendous. Yeah. And I love Donald Hall's work, and he's a New Hampshire guy. I mean, he I think he went to University of Michigan or something like that, but he spent most of his life on a farm in New Hampshire. So we're very familiar. I'm very familiar with his work. The interesting thing is, I think we go from, as young people, we say, what does life mean? And we, kind of sit around and we drink beer and talk late into the night about what it means. Yeah. And then as we get older, we sit around and go to sleep at 8 o'clock. But we say, what did life mean? Right? We never quite are in that one place where we go, oh, we now know what life means. So it's just a transition. So I think part and parcel with that is people get in touch when they hear that somebody has a terminal diagnosis. But also, I had recently gone through my 50th high school reunion. I didn't actually attend because COVID was around and I had this cancer diagnosis and all of that. But I got a lot of notes from people, and, you have this kind of communication. And I realized after a while that first of all, they didn't really want anything specific from me. They just simply wanted to say, how'd it go? How was your life? And I wanted to ask them, how was your life? And, the amount of details that it would have taken to fill in, well, we had 3 kids and we lived in Cleveland, all that sort of stuff. We didn't really do that. We just kind of waved. We were like on a merry-go-round and waved at each other. And I found that tendency, that desire to set things straight, to now arrange all the shoes in the closet properly. I wasn't buying it. I didn't buy that. I didn't speak to some people for many years, as life just went along. And now with cancer, I didn't feel like, okay, now I need to really talk to this person. If I had needed to talk to them, I should have talked to them then. It's kind of the whole bucket list thing. Like, I am always saddened to hear, well, now it's bucket list. I'm going to go do this. It's like, no, you should have been doing that stuff along the way, or not. Yeah. Don't do it if you don't want to. But it seems false to just suddenly say, okay, I've got 2 years to live, and I'm going to go and try to do everything. I'm going to jump out of a plane. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Oh, I'm with you. One of my favorite writer cartoonists talked about, well, it was a weird thing. It was 3 people at a dinner, me, him, and one of my best friend, really my best friend, who ended up dying unexpectedly about 2 months later. The cartoonist talked about the bullshit of bucket lists and said, I'd rather just walk my dog around the corner, and take him for a walk one more time and do the things as you do in the book. The magic in day-to-day life is more important. Although, all of that said, the book does culminate in an experience that, one could say is a sort of bucket list thing. You explicitly avoid doing that and just turned it into the vacation we want to take, or the thing we'd want to go do that's of a piece with how you lived the rest of your life. But no, I'm with you. There was no sense of, I need to do X, Y, and Z, but again, in my little 10-day interval of clearly I'm dying, all I figured was there are only one or two people I really want to record with before I'm gone. I better go get them lined up. And then when I got the reprieve, a la Dostoevsky, I just had I should still hunt down one of those guys because I know he's dying and we really should sit down and talk. Yeah. And I went into that episode thinking we were going to have this deep conversation about art, death, and everything else. It went so differently than I was expecting. It made everything completely worthwhile because it wasn't what I wanted. What I thought I needed for my soul. It turned out to be something so immeasurably different and so rewarding. It was important to hunt down that sort of thing, but not to dictate it, right. I guess. Yeah. No bucket list type thing for me. There's much more, finding a good conversation like this. Right.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm with you. And pleasure in small things, the small moments. One of the things I heard Kurt Vonnegut in some sort of lecture talk about, he had an uncle who used to stop when something really good was going on and say, "Isn't this just great? Isn't this a moment we should all, like they're having a picnic under an apple tree and spring and the blossoms are out, and I think that uncle is right. I mean, there are moments, even I'm up here in Maine now. There are moments where the meadow is full, the grass is, the wind is blowing. We've got lupin season right now. The sea is gray and beautiful. And I think, isn't this good? This is pretty good right now. But I've never, all of us, I think, seek beauty, but the difficulty is trying to absorb it and try to make it our own. That's a tricky thing to try to do. But I think we could train ourselves to be open to that.
Yeah, for me, it coincided again, this is all just the coincidence of when I had my physical and this all turned up. Just a few months before the diagnosis, I took up drawing at a few weeks after turning 50 and discovered, there's a whole thing where you just look at something and take it in and try to figure out how to make your hand and the pen or pencil make these marks that somehow represent, and you're cutting all this conscious brain right out, and you're living in this moment. Yep. So I got to start experiencing that just coincidentally a few months before this experience happened to me. But yeah, that was also again, life changing is a weird phrase to use at this point, but that was something that mattered even more than the diagnosis, was just that learning to see and breathe. Right. So
lens changing perhaps.
Yeah, that works. I like that. So
Susan paints some watercolors, and she stuck a piece of paper and some watercolors in front of me, and I felt absolutely paralyzed. I thought, I don't know where to put the brush. The very first stroke, I don't know what to do.
I will send you some of what I did, or at least links to what I did, and you will see at the beginning. I joke, but it looks like a stroke victim who is figuring out how to regain control of his hand. Yeah. And within like 3 weeks, that's a tree with detailed shading and bark and all this other stuff.
Yeah. But no, I like that. I like that a lot. Yeah. Yeah. I see how that would be a way of bringing beauty into, making sense of it.
Yeah. And just of learning to slow down and see and just not have to be, especially not, I need to get this on my phone, just oh God. Yeah. Yeah. There's a great deal of that. And I'm glad you bring that up in the book too, that sense of leaving the phone behind and, again, taking in the world as it is. But tell me, you mentioned where the title comes from, but, I'm not going to mention it in the intro. Tell us about Goodbye to Clocks Ticking. Well, where you derive the title.
Most of your listeners will probably know, but it's from Emily's monologue, Emily in Our Town by Thornton Wilder, who's again a New Hampshire guy. And my son was actually in the play, and it was interesting. I read it in high school and went back and saw it, and he was pretty good in it. And I thought the Emily was very good in it. I remember being quite moved. I think if I remember, the first act is really, really moving. And the second act, not so much. But the first act, I think, concludes with Emily's monologue. And in it, she says goodbye to her mother and father, to Mama and Papa, and to Grover's Corner, and to her butternut tree, to coffee, to sleep, to waking from sleep, to food. And then she said, and goodbye to clocks ticking. And that phrase had always stuck with me, just because it just seems like a simple, elegant way to say that's what we're saying goodbye to. You know, we're saying goodbye to these small things. And then she asked the stage manager, does anybody ever really see the beauty of the world? And he says, poets and saints, they do some, and that's it. Mm-hmm. You know, that's it. Yeah. So we live in a certain blindness that Emily only sees after her death. And of course, not that I now suddenly see everything clearly, but I certainly had a wake up call, and I certainly had a relensing, like just like we were talking about, a new lens to look through.
Are you writing now?
I am, and I've had the devil of a time writing, because I'm trying to fix this in my own mind. I wonder what is significant. It's kind of what Annie Diller said, what's not trivial right now. So I've come up with these ideas, and I've had a couple of ideas. I've even got like 20,000 words into something. And I think, do I really care? Do I really care? And the other thing is that the whole business of writing, sending it to my agents, getting my agents' Sure. reactions, have the agents send it out. I don't know if I'm up for that anymore. I might, if somebody said you're going to live another 5 years, I'd say, yeah, okay, maybe so. But if given the forecast that I have in my life, maybe another year, I don't know that I really care about going through that. So again, people say, well, you should write something very personal then, but I don't know about that either. I don't know. I've done that pretty much with this clock's ticking. So I don't know. I still write. I've actually started playing around with some ideas about looking back at my childhood, and that might turn into some, who knows? I still like to do it, but I don't know why I'm doing it exactly.
And that's that question from the beginning, whether, it quote unquote matters. That's the tough thing to determine. One of the things, when you mentioned how personal the book is, well, I'll put it this way. One of my closest pals got diagnosed out of the blue with a stage 4 glioblastoma about 4 months ago. Knows 12 to 16 months at best.
Right.
And very early on in our conversations about this, it was whether he would consider assisted suicide, however you want to phrase it. And I was, again, glad you discuss it in the course of the book, and, how one would do it, and what state you would have to be in to really consider that. Is it something you keep as things are great now? If things change, this is still, potentially an option, or is it something that's sort of just not where you, where are you on suicide? I know.
I know. It's a funny, well, just as a little brief aside, it's about this thing. When the book came out, I had a reading at our local bookstore. It was a nice reading. And because the word got out, a lot of my former students were there, and some of my colleagues were there. And I thought, wow, this is first of all, it's a nice turnout. And secondly, aren't they nice to have come here to sort of hear what I have to say? And lastly, aren't they freaking hungry to talk about death? Yeah. I was really amazed at that, because, so you're asking about the death with dignity. Everybody is fascinated with death. We all need to confront it in one way or the other. And we kind of go along without doing it. And so to have it turned out to be a lovely evening, and we had a frank discussion about a lot of elements of what I was going through. A couple of people in the audience volunteered that they also had cancer, and they were confronting, potential death. It ended up being very cathartic, a really nice conversation, because we had permission to talk about death. And so we have this taboo around death, and, I'm an old Catholic, so, suicide and all that. By all means, death with dignity is in play. Oddly, I live in New Hampshire, which is a state that doesn't permit it. New Hampshire has some strange attitudes about life, but Maine does, and also Vermont does. And Vermont, they just
see, it's funny because you have live free or die, right. But in this case, yes. Live free and die. Yeah. Well, anyway, go.
Yeah, we always say live, freeze and die. But Yeah, so I guess somebody just sued in Vermont to say you don't have to be a resident. You should be able to just come in and use Vermont as a way to die, and that was upheld in the courts, from what I understand. So, it's going to come back to play. Again, there's another thing. Like, do you start arranging your own death ceremonies? Do you make these provisions? When do you start doing that? Like when you're throwing a party, but you don't know when the party's coming.
Yeah, yeah. I it's to me, it's of a piece with what you were saying before about the, people. If you wanted to see these people, you would have, you would have seen them before you got the news, because one of my early moments was maybe I would do a pre-memorial service. And it was like, wow, I'd be putting everybody on, as you mentioned, putting everybody on the spot for, now we have to say something about this guy while he's here and dying, as opposed to doing it the way things have been done for
50 years,
all of man's history.
Yeah.
But, a friend of mine was dying up in Vermont, lived in Vermont, the cartoonist Ed Koren from the New Yorker, with lung cancer. He was a volunteer fireman, and I think some of the smoke exposure and asbestos and everything may have been an issue. But that was when he told me about it last fall. That was the first I had heard about Vermont and the again, Death with Dignity movement, and how he was saving it for, when things looked pretty bad. But just a few months ago, he finally went, and I don't know if it was on his own terms or
interesting.
Yeah.
Well, I mean,
but I think go on.
I know it sounds silly or sacrilegious, but one of the dogs I loved most in the world was my dog Laika. She was a sled dog, and when I took her to have her euthanized, I couldn't have been sadder. I was teary, crying, the whole thing. But I was glad to do that for her. She was shot. There was nothing left to her. So I don't know why we're so peculiar about human beings that way. I mean, it doesn't make a lot of sense to me practically.
Probably because we're far less nice than dogs.
Yes, I guess so.
In my world, dogs, you look at them, you feel loved. People, there's always a motive going on. Yes, with a dog, they want, food or scritchies and rubbies. But
hey, what kind of dog do you have? You said you were taking the dog.
Greyhound.
Oh,
I've
nice.
got a big, goofy greyhound. One of the world's laziest dogs.
Yeah.
He finished his running career and he is done.
Yeah.
He's been perfectly fine just lounging around.
That's cool. Yeah, they're supposed to be very, very relaxed dogs. That's great.
Yeah, just giant couch potato, but to the point at which he has his own couch in our living room.
Yeah,
basically,
nice.
If I get on it, he'll just start kind of nudging me with his paw, trying to get me away because he likes having the room to stretch out.
I love dogs. Yeah.
But that's having gone through that a few times, as you have, there is that sense of we're doing this for them. They don't know that, this is coming, but it's partly this puts me in mind of another episode that I will connect you with, a past guest of mine, Haley Campbell. She did a book last year called All the Living and the Dying about people whose jobs involved being around the dead.
Huh.
So undertakers, people who do autopsies, people who clean death scenes, and all sorts of other jobs and occupations that put people in proximity of dead people. And the big lesson early on was the first dead person you see should not be someone you love, someone from your family. If you had exposure to people, in a non, if it's not a huge shock and a huge emotional resonance, you become more comfortable with, okay, this is what it means to be dead. Not that, you lose the value of life, but what Haley does over the course of the book, her own reactions to some of these experiences start to warp her significantly. It's a really fascinating book. I'll zap you a link to it afterwards.
Sounds great.
Yeah, but that was part of this. And you and I have both experienced the oncologist and what it means to have that job and have to tell people what they have to tell people.
Yeah.
And it's, I guess a lot different than us either being, in your case, an imaginative writer, in my case, a semi-decent conversationalist and a lobbyist for the pharmaceutical industry. But
no, absolutely. I'm always I always marvel at my oncologist's skill at broaching tough subjects, at being honest without being over direct. I don't know quite the word to say it, but he has grace in talking about the whole thing, and that's not an easy thing to have, and to do it. I don't know, however many times he does it a day, talking, and particularly like the first time a patient comes to see him, to be able to say, "Hey, buddy, you're done for."
Yeah,
that's a lot. That's a lot to have to do as a job.
I think mine loves me because I get to tell him everything's fine. Come back in 6 months. Yeah. But I'll tell you, when I first, this goes back to, I take my physical, get the blood test, white blood cell count is high, go get another one in 2 weeks. Gil, you need to go call this oncologist and make an appointment. I called and they said, oh, well, the oncologist you've been referred to, he's not available for another 5 weeks, but his associate is available in 10 days. Would you rather have an appointment with her? And I was like, somebody puts this off for 5 weeks? Like, oh, you'd be surprised, sir. I was like, oh, no, I'd like to know as soon as fucking possible exactly what the situation is. But that was my very first moment entering that world, was the discovery that some people will put off entering that world for quite a while. But in my case, again, she was burbling, oh, this is wonderful. You have chronic lymphocytic leukemia and you've probably got the dormant one. And I'm like, what? I don't know anything right now.
Yeah.
All I looked up was the worst possible cases. So.
Yeah. Well, Susan has been a great teacher to me. She's worked for many years in the disability community. And she talks about how the people who are disabled refer to people who are able as temps. And your day will come where you need the raised toilet, the ramp to the door, the push button to open the door. You're going to need all those things. We're just waiting for it. And that was a real wake up call to me. It's like the line between being a healthy person is a different land than the person being sick, but actually it's an imaginary line. There's no line. It's you're constantly crossing over one way or the other. So I mean, she taught me
we're
that.
Immortal.
Yeah.
You were immortal the day you retired.
Right.
And 3 days later it was, this.
That was a pretty interesting 3 days. That was a surprise. Yeah. No question. Yeah. I mean, we put so much stuff in this culture on retirement. Hey, we're going to retire. Hey, you're going to be the old guy in shaggy khakis going down to, get in his boat, and then, bang, you got cancer, you're dying. It was a wake up call.
And again, not in the book, you talk about regrets and how ultimately they're not significant enough. But, were there aspects? I'll put it this way. When I recorded with J.D. McClatchy years ago, he had gotten over prostate cancer, was working on his finances with his accountant at this point around 69, 70 years old. Mm-hmm. And the accountant's like, well, how long do you expect to live? He's like, oh, another 20 years. The accountant just gave him the side eye with like, hey, Sandy, you just beat prostate cancer. Let's not expect 90 in your future. Let's think more 10 years. He ended up dead within about 5 or 6 years because colon cancer showed up after that. But for you, that sense of the things you had planned for, or the idea of, all these things are going to do during retirement, throwing that out the window and now sort of not salvaging, but, rediscovering what matters, what doesn't matter. Well, again, I know the book is about that, but, how has that experience been for you, again, as you're sort of open-ended like this?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, it's not easy because so much of life is going forward, and I'll do this and then I'll do that, and I'll have, this job will lead to this connection or this place I'm going. And a lot of that is just thrown out the window when you receive a diagnosis like the one I've received. So instead it's quieter. The whole thing is quieter, I guess, in my mind. People keep saying, well, what are you going to do next? Well, I don't know. Is there something I should be doing? And then there's an impatience in me that is something that I probably had throughout my life. Well, I should go and do X. I should do, but I don't, I don't have any strong feeling about what that is. The other thing you talk about is, I mentioned in the book is regret. And Susan asked me, she goes, what do you mean regrets? And when I talked about regrets, what I really meant was things that were dissatisfying. Like, when I look back and I had a communication with somebody that wasn't good, or that I didn't behave in the most honorable fashion, I won't be sad to lose that memory. You know what I mean? In other words,
Yeah.
we think of so much about the good things we experience, but there are also some bad things along the way, and I'll be glad to see those removed from my memory.
I think the thing we did at like 6 years old that we still physically flinch at the memory of, the fact that won't exist for anyone else once our brains start to dissolve.
Right.
Yeah, I'm good with that.
Yeah, I am too. I find some consolation in that. That's okay.
Yeah. The idea that there's no recording angel can be a positive in some respects.
Yes, absolutely.
So, my big question, who are you reading? And you mentioned a couple of books earlier, but, what are you working on? And is there a book on the horizon for you?
Well, I mentioned Stegner. I've also read this Ruth Rendell. And I'll pick up just about anything, as I said. And I get the New Yorker for better or worse. I don't know. It seems like a homework assignment sometimes. But,
it's the only weekly that takes 6 weeks to read. But,
I got a whole pile of them up here. I keep telling myself, I'll get to them all now. So I've come to peace with the New Yorker, by the way. I use the table of contents and I look at the things I want to look at and forget the rest. So that helps. But yeah, so I'm always reading something. And as far as books that I'm writing or things like that, as I mentioned, I'm kind of fooling around with things from my past. I'm interested. Here's the thing. I'm interested in my past in the sense that, back in some primordial past, I would have stood in front of the fire with an oak staff and feathers in my hair and said, "This is what it was like to be me," and I would bore people for a couple nights, and the kids would, because they had to have something to do, they would listen. So I'm interested in these old stories of mine, but I'm old enough to realize, and I think smart enough to realize, other people aren't that interested. If I could put it into a memoir, would people be interested? Kind of, this is my life, the sort of Keith Richards kind of book. I thought, well, maybe, maybe that would, but I actually don't even care whether other people would be interested. It might be an interesting process for me. Yeah. So, and then again, and the other thing is, you don't need a publisher for anything anymore. You can just get it published yourself.
Again, you look at me doing this crazy business every week.
Yeah.
And the other thing I will send you, I started, 3 years ago, I put out a zine of essays, poems, and excerpts from the show. I just did a second one a couple of weeks ago. So I will send you those so you can say, oh, thank God Gil never went into writing. But, and you can, appreciate, whatever the hell else I do. But, I have what I write, things that I write, important enough to me, not necessarily something I'd necessarily want to see go through the whole gatekeeper world. And I'd rather just share and promulgate, I guess, or infect the world as best I can.
Yeah, I talked with a poet and I asked her, I said, why are you guys still sending out poems? Why don't you just put them in on a mailing list to, 100 people or whoever? And it's the same thing. She goes, you're right. But I still need that affirmation of putting it on paper and having somebody say it's good. So she was being honest about it. But it's kind of funny.
No, and I get that for most people. For me, it's my day job treats me fine. I'll pay to print 500 of these and send them out to people. And
it was good enough for Walt Whitman, right? I mean, what the heck?
Yeah, I figure, I have the hair, but not the beard. So, I could pull it off too. Yeah. So my last resonance, or thread through the book that struck me, you bring up the character of Odysseus and the idea of, again, the man of many ways and that cleverness, being able to escape most situations. And then the realization that there is no escape. I'll say what struck me by the end of the book was another version of Odysseus from Tennyson, the Ulysses poem that he did. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but that line where he's trying to rally the old men back in Ithaca to go on one more adventure, and he says to them, "Though much is taken, much abides."
Mm-hmm.
And it it struck me in terms of what you've gone through and what, I have facing me down the line, that, there is that for everything we lose, your book isn't just about the losses, but about the things you're finding and that which abides and continues beyond. So we have different Odysseus's, and when you get to Dante, you'll see another Ulysses in a very different light.
I have to read it?
It really, it's so, well, again, that's that big question. Does it matter if you read it? Read anything now. And that's what as people who've devoted our lives to the book, what does it mean to see the end coming and decide what books matter or, what books still matter that we need to get to.
Well, Alan Lelchuk, who's an old friend of mine, a contemporary of Philip Roth and Saul Bellow, and from that same sort of genre, he used to call young men who like books lit boys. He said, so when I first met him, he goes, "Oh, so you're one of those lit boys, are you?" I said, "Yeah, I guess so." But yeah, some people have been. But yeah, you can't. I mean, there's always going to be lacuna, right? There's always going to be a book that you haven't read or a thing. I mean, I don't think it matters ultimately, right? There's so many. Yeah. I mean, how many African novels can we name? There are very, very few that most people have read.
Yeah. And much in terms of what we were talking about with regret, once we're gone, outside of people looking over my list of what I have and haven't read, no one's going to know.
Right.
That's but yeah, that question of what we still do to edify ourselves.
Yeah.
And what it means. So yeah, I'll send you the translation of Dante if you're, interested. Go for it.
Yeah, please.
It just turns out to be much more rich and fulfilling in a way. It turns out to be much less arduous until you get to the third book.
Okay.
Paradiso. But it's something that created ways of looking at other things in the world for me.
Oh, I'd love to read it. Yeah. Well, now I have to. Okay.
I'm just saying is all. I mean, your book did the same thing for me, except, on a much more personal level. Right. That's why we keep reading.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, no, absolutely.
But Joe, I don't just want to thank you for coming on. I want to thank you for writing the book and for the honesty that's in there. Which again, I don't know if it resonates with someone who doesn't have and again, my experience is like a tourist compared to yours, but the way this book resonates, you've done something phenomenal with what could have been a very self-pitying or otherwise just, silent thing or moment for you. So,
well, thank you very much. I really do appreciate you saying that.
And that was Joseph Monninger. His new memoir is Goodbye to Ticking Clocks, How We Live While Dying, from Steerforth Press. I loved it, and I think it'll resonate with readers who aren't on Planet Cancer like I am. It says a lot about life itself, not just life when you've got this specter over you. I mean, it just illuminates what we make of our lives and how we integrate that sense of our mortality to live more fully without just spiraling into despair. Joe is not on social media, and honestly, you think he regrets that? I don't. Again, if I get hit with that worst bad news someday, I don't think I'll be spending a lot of time on Twitter and Instagram afterwards. But anyway, I will have links to the book and a short video Joe made about it in the show and episode notes for this one. The other thing I want to add, besides, again, thanking Vince Ches for connecting us, I've recorded with a couple of people who were terminally ill at the time. And I told Joe this afterwards. The idea that someone who only has a couple of years left or 6 months left, God knows how much, would choose to spend like an hour or two of that with me, just having a conversation, it means a lot to me. It is a responsibility of sorts, I guess. The sense that I'm trying to, we'll say, capture a little of somebody who might be gone soon. So again, I want to thank Joe. We recorded at 7 a.m. on a Saturday because that was the best time for him. And, I was just ecstatic that we got to sit down and talk and share some of our experiences. So Now with the regular stuff. You can support the Virtual Memories Show just by listening to it. You can also tell other people about it and let them know there's this guy out there making these podcasts every week with interesting, creative people. You can also help the show by telling me what you like and don't like about it, who you want to hear me record with, or what movie or TV show or book or piece of music or theater or art exhibition or whatever you think I should check out or turn listeners on to. And you can do that by sending me an email, DM, postcard, or letter. My address is in the end of my Substack every week. You can find it there. Or by using my Google Voice number. That's 973-869-9659. That goes directly to voicemail, so you don't have to worry about getting stuck in an awkward conversation with me. And messages can go up to 3 minutes. So if you go longer than that, it'll cut you off. Just call back and leave another message. And let me know if it would be okay to include your message in an upcoming episode of the show. You might have something interesting to share with the listeners, but I would never do that without the speaker's permission. Now, if you got money to spare, don't give it to me. I mean, subscribe to the Substack, buy an issue of my Haiku for Business Travelers, or send me money for it. But my day job treats me well, and my expenses are pretty minimal for the podcast. So I hope if you've got money to spare, you'll give it to people or institutions in need. You can find people through GoFundMe, Patreon, Kickstarter, Indiegogo, Crowdfunder, and other crowdfunding platforms like that. And if you're looking for somewhere to go with institutions or foundations, I give to my local food bank, and you can't really go wrong with that sort of thing. I also donate sometimes to the Poor People's Campaign. I make targeted election contributions, but, I'm a lobbyist, so that's part of my job. But there are other things you can do. Freedom funds, Planned Parenthood and Women's Choice funds. There are all sorts of ways that you can use your money to try to help build a better world. So I hope you will. As I mentioned earlier, I have the second issue of my zine, Haiku for Business Travelers, and a second printing of the first issue. The new one is 32 pages of essays, poems, photography, a bunch of my drawings and art, and an excerpt of my great conversation with Clive James from 2015. It is print only. It is free. You can give me money if you like, but just let me know if you want a copy of issue 1 or 2 or both. And if you want to, support it all, you can hit paypal.me/VMSpod or subscribe to the Substack, vmspod.substack.com. There's a paid subscription tier for that. And anyway, all that money's just going to go into production and postage for the next issue. Our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. You should visit my archives to check out my episode with Hal from the summer of 2018 and learn more about his art and painting. And you can listen to his music at soundcloud.com/Mayforth. And that's MAY4TH. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with another great conversation. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at vmspod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please tell your pals, talk it up on social media, and go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. It all goes to helping us build a bigger audience. You've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.